they can lock on to the hormone receptors. When they're larger, it's sort of, they block it. The best analogy I can use is each hormone receptor is like a lock and a key, and the chemical has a certain shape and go into the receptor and send a signal to the cell. That's like a key. If I was to say we locked that door and I had a large iron bar and I tried to open it, I can't because the key won't go in. But if I shape it properly, I can use that same iron and open it. Or I can turn that wire into a thin, I can turn that steel into a thin bit of wire and use it as a lockpick and open it. And that's what happens with these chemicals when they go down to very small levels. They're like the lockpick. They can either fit in and open it, or just fit in and block it so you can't put the actual key in. So that the actual chemical signal, the hormone signal you need, is disrupted. And that's why it's called endocrine disruption. And so when we have what we call the average daily intake of chemicals, what they do is they feed animals and until they make sure they're looking at them under microscopes, which was very good science in the 1800s. But now we've got things like, and I'll show you MRI scans, we can use human cell lines and culture them. We have much more sophisticated, non-destructive techniques for looking at these chemicals rather than just feeding them to an animal, killing them, and making a comparison under a microscope. But they still use that, and they say, oh, look at this level, it's called the level of no observable adverse effect. Then we'll bring it down, we'll make it even smaller by 100 or 1,000 to get our level of safety, so therefore it's safe. But what we know with endocrine disruption, if we bring it down, say by a level of 1,000, it could actually be more toxic. We don't actually test at that level. It's just an extrapolation and an assumption by lowering the dose it is safe. When we have an enormous body of science showing hundreds and hundreds of chemicals where they are far more toxic, and I'll go into more detail about that. So it's a data-free assumption. Every single chemical residue that we have on our food, there is no testing at the actual level to determine that it's safe. Pure extrapolation and data-free assumptions, completely unscientific based on the science that we have. So the other myth is the breakdown myth. Yes, we ban DDT, or some countries have. Countries like China, Uganda and India are still using it widely. So we've only actually banned a handful of basically organochlorine chemicals. We said that was because they are residual in new chemicals. They break down rapidly, so we don't need to worry about them. Well, if they broke down rapidly, why do we have to have maximum residue levels for them? Because the fact is they don't. And they last for weeks. So that's a mythology. The other one is you say, oh yes, look, it breaks down, and after X amount of weeks, you can't find it. But what they don't tell you is that when the main chemicals, say chlorpyrifos or malathion, will break down and turns into an oxin, and that oxin usually is 100 times more toxic. So yes, it breaks down, but unfortunately it's now worse. And so the longer we keep the food in the fridge, the more toxic it gets, and particularly with the things they put in, for fruit like tomatoes, grown in Florida, or fruit where they have, in California where they have fruit fly. They can't kill the actual eggs, so they put enough poison in the fruit. When the larvae hatches and they get little maggots, they get poisoned. And that has to last for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And that's supposed to be safe for us. Still toxic enough 3 weeks later to kill the larvae when they hatch. The other one then, which I go into great detail about, is our regulatory authorities and how they have literally and failed us. That all they're doing is taking unpublished studies from the companies as their data and ignoring hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of very good peer-reviewed studies in the open literature, in the scientific literature, and they ignore it. So I go into great detail on it, and I think, you know, it's something that we really need to take them to task on. And I'm not just talking about the regulatory authorities here in the USA, in my own country, in Europe. I give examples of how they've set these NOLs, these no observable adverse effect levels, back in 1985, and hundreds of studies we've had since then showing what a nonsense this is. And so what has the result been? Instead of actually banning the chemical, lowering the amount, you know, here in the US and in Europe, in my own country, for instance, with glyphosate, the main chemical for Roundup-ready plants, they've raised it. Why? Because with the use of Roundup on GM crops now, there's no way that you can keep the level below the legal MRL level. So the easiest thing to do that is to raise the MRL. Therefore, it's all legal now. And that's the problem with these people. They are in the pockets of the companies, and they continuously ignore good science, and regulation should be based on good, published, independent, peer-reviewed science, and not on data-free assumptions. The most important myth for me is the myth that we have to have these toxic chemicals. Otherwise we're going to starve. We can't grow food without them. And so I go into great detail, giving very good examples, particularly here from the USA, where now that we've got research, and here in Iowa we've got very good work with people like Kathleen DeLate, you know, people like the Rodale Institute. Now, where we can show we can get higher yields from organic than from conventional. We've got that research now. And so what I want to, the message I want to give out now is that we need to put this R&D, this research dollars, into non-chemical organic forms rather than what we're doing now, where it's all spent on toxic chemicals and GMOs. The research that we've done with iPhone, when we look at there's 52 billion spent a year on agricultural research, and less than $4 in every 1,000 goes to research that is applicable to organic. Most of it goes to toxic chemicals and GMOs. If we could just get that up to 1 or 2%, 2 or 3, say $20 or $30 per 1,000, given what we're getting out of research, we would change our agriculture overnight, because we're starting to get very good results that we can get higher yields without these toxic chemicals. So what I want to do now is just go into a little bit more detail of one of the areas I'll concentrate on, because our children are our future. That's why you're here, because the value of education, the value of our children. And one of the most important things that we should do is make sure they have the best start in life, that we're not poisoning them, before they're even born. We have very good evidence showing that these chemicals, and I'll go into some detail here, but I'll go into good detail in the book, are causing lower IQs, the whole epidemic of ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, lack of physical coordination, loss of temper, anger management. I know that's something you're very good at doing here, by dealing with it, not causing it. And bipolar, schizophrenia spectrum, depression, and the other really interesting one which I'll go into is childhood obesity, and how endocrine disruption is upsetting the whole metabolic process, and why we're seeing this epidemic all around the world now of obesity. It's not purely just junk food. Here's a friend and I, I'm one of the co-authors of a paper that was just published a few weeks ago, and this is some of the data that we published here for the USA. So we looked at a whole range of diseases, and we found 23 with a high rate of correlation between the increase in glyphosate in GM crops and the diseases. This is to do with autism in the USA.